it brings us from chaos into order. It brings order to chaos. That's what culture does. Culture is powerful. European understands that. It binds us to each other. It gives us identity. It gives us a reason for surviving. And then it tells us who we should live for and who we should die for if we have to. Culture is an energy source for thriving. And it gives us a sense of security. It also puts us into a system of accountability. We are accountable to our ancestors. Now, when you're looking at all of that, and it's a template for living, then think about it. And it is a petri dish. So that African culture becomes a petri dish, it produces Africans. It cultivates Africans. And no other culture can make that statement. You hear me? No other culture can produce and cultivate Africans. Only African culture can do that. If we look at culture like that and see it as a means by which a people protect themselves, then we could understand culture as the immune system of a people. Think of people as an organism, and culture is that immune system, right? Okay. Now what does the immune system do? The immune system, you have the T cells, you've got the lymphocytes, which become the warriors, right? Their job is to recognize the antigens. An antigen is a foreign body which threatens the health of the whole. And that's when you get that seek and destroy. All right? That's right. Because their job is to neutralize or eliminate in any way that disease, that poison, those antigens, those things that work against the health of the whole. Okay? Now, we look at culture as that. Genetic memory, if you read the medical journals, is connected to the immune system. They all talk about that. And I'm fascinated with genetic memory. So that there are these memory cells which carry the knowledge and information about how to defeat the disease. And I'm saying culture is all of that. Right? Okay, so what happens? You got the Ma'afa. Everybody know what the Ma'afa is? The Ma'afa is a great disaster. That's the kidnapping of us and all of that. The disconnecting us from that cultural womb. Okay? The Ma'afa carries the virus. The virus is the Urubu virus. See, all of this is very culture specific. This is all about us. I ain't talking about anybody else right now. I'm talking about us. When we use the term Ma'afa, we're talking about an African experience, something that was done to us. We're not comparing it with anybody else's. If we did compare it with anybody else's, we would understand that it is the worst crime against humanity ever committed by one race of people. And I can support that too. Right? So it carries this virus. Now, while the Ma'afa is carrying the virus, the process of the Ma'afa is Europeans committing cultural genocide against African people.
Yes.
What is genocide? The killing of the genes. So they have always worked to erase our cultural memory. Why? You see, you erase the cultural memory. What is that going to do? It's going to destroy and break down the immune system. Is it not? Okay. So we become vulnerable. And what is the nature of a virus? Virus really has no life of its own. Right? Did you know that? A virus needs a host.
That's right.
And cannot be without being attached to that host. And in the Ma'afa, we become hosts for the Yoruba gods. And that's what that's about.
It is not enough to write a revolutionary hymn to be a part of the African Revolution. One has to join with the people to make this revolution. Make it with the people, and the hymn will automatically follow. For an act to be automatic, one has to be a vital part of Africa and its thinking, part of all that popular energy mobilized for the liberation, progress, and happiness of Africa. Outside this single struggle, there is no place for either the artist or the intellectual who is not committed to totally mobilize with the people in the great fight waged by Africa and suffering humanity. And that is the statement by Sekou Touré. So moving on with Frantz Fanon. Each generation must discover its mission, fulfill it or betray it in relative opacity. In the underdeveloped countries, preceding generations have simultaneously resisted the insidious agenda of colonialism and paved the way for the emergence of the current struggles. Now that we are in the heat of combat, we must shed the habit of decrying the efforts of our forefathers and feigning incomprehension at their silence or passiveness. They fought as best they could with the weapons they possessed at the time, and if their struggle did not reverberate throughout the international arena, the reason should be attributed not so much to a lack of heroism, but to a fundamentally different international situation. More than one colonized subject has to say, we've had enough. More than one tribe had to rebel. More than one peasant revolt had to be quelled. More than one demonstration to be repressed. For us today to stand firm, certain of our victory. For us who are determined to break the back of colonialism, our heroic mission is to authorize every revolt, every desperate act, and every attack aborted or drowned in blood. In this chapter, we shall analyze the fundamental issue of the legitimate claim to a nation. The political party that mobilizes the people, however, is little concerned with this issue of legitimacy. Political parties are concerned solely with the daily reality, and it is in the name of this reality, in the name of this immediacy, which influences the present and future of men and women, that they make their call to action. The political party may very well speak to the nation in emotional terms, but it is primarily interested in getting the people who are listening to understand that they must join in the struggle if they want to quite simply exist. Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. Happy Monday. Welcome back to On the Shoulders of Giants. I am Joseph Ward, continuing my reading of Frantz Fanon's book, The Wretched of the Earth, and I am on the chapter on national culture, which starts on page 145 and goes to page 179. 180. 145 to 180 is on national culture. So I started with the video of Dr. Marimba Ani giving us an explanation of what culture is, or rather what culture is supposed to be, what African culture, what Black culture is supposed to be, how it is supposed to work and cultivate its people. Now, in this chapter, in this book, we're gonna explore how our culture has changed. And our culture has changed due to the influence of colonialism or white supremacy and the will of the wanting to of the bourgeoisie or the educated class or the leaders of the political people who want to assimilate into white culture. Assimilation into white culture in their minds is going to be the key to liberation. Hence, can we be liberated? Is assimilation the path to liberation, right? Of course, we're going to say no, that's the answer to that. But in the minds of those who see the white world as the free world, they have a need to assimilate because they see that as their freedom. They see that as their liberation. They see that as their sanctuary. If we're over here, we're free from the bondage. We're free from the poverty. We're free from the oppression. We're free from all the problems. But the problem with that is you're leaving out the masses. And also, You're setting yourself up for failure, especially for your Negro wake-up call, but your people will not advance like that. You can't keep taking the resources out of the community and expecting the community to grow, and then looking back and pointing your fingers at the community and saying, why aren't you growing? Well, you keep taking the resources out. At this point, the people are the resources. We have to remember that. Our people are the resources. We don't own much. We don't control much. We don't build much. We don't create much. So our people are the resources. So we're talking about, like you said, the fundamental issue of the legitimate claim of a nation. The political party that mobilizes the people, however, is little concerned with the issue of legitimacy, because the political parties are solely with daily reality, and in its name of this reality, in the name of this immediacy, which influences the present and the future of men and women, that they make that call to action. The political party may very well speak of the nation in emotional terms. I'm going to tell you stuff to make you feel good. Now, this chapter may hurt a lot of people's feelings because we are addressing the elephant in the room of the historian, the intellectual, the artist, the educator, the people who bring the emotionalism to the revolution. Like we said in the beginning, it's one thing to talk about the revolution. It's one thing to write about the revolution. It's one thing to create music about the revolution, but it's another thing to be a part of the revolution and actually make it happen. No, that's the reason why we started doing our breakdowns on Friday, is because, you know, we got tired of just the intellectualizing. We cannot intellectualize our way into liberation. We cannot assimilate our way into liberation. We have to take it. So let's jump back into the reading, page 146, the third paragraph. We know that in the first place of the national struggle, colonialism attempts to diffuse nationalist demands by manipulating economic doctrine. At the first signs of a dispute, colonialism feigns comprehension and acknowledging with ostentatious humility that the territory is suffering from serious underdevelopment that requires major social and economic reforms. And it is true that certain spectacular measures, such as the opening of work sites for the underdeveloped here and there, delayed the formation of a national consciousness by a few years. But sooner or later, colonialism realizes it is incapable of achieving a program of socioeconomic reforms that will satisfy the aspirations of the colonial masses. That's important. Even when it comes to filling their bellies, colonialism proves to be inherently powerless. The colonist state very quickly discovers that any attempt to disarm the national parties at a purely economic level will be tantamount to practicing in the colonies what it did not want to do in its own territory. So the colonists find themselves in the position where you've created the situation with these people, and these people depend on you, but you're not in a position to actually give them what they need. So these people go further into poverty. The disparities increase, the desperation increases. Right? So the people are between a rock and a hard place. The colonists, the colonizers who created the situation don't have an answer for the situation. And the so-called leaders who are supposed to be helping to lead you out of the situation have no solution either, because the leaders are trying to ingratiate themselves with the white supremacists or the colonists. So the masses find themselves in a bad place, and the only people that can save the masses are the masses. I can see the fact that the actual existence of an Aztec civilization has done little to change the diet of today's Mexican peasants. I can see that whatever proof there is of a once mighty Songhai civilization does not change the fact that the Songhais today are undernourished, illiterate, abandoned to the skies and water, and a blank mind and glazed eyes. But as we have said on several occasions, this passionate quest for a national culture prior to the colonial era can be justified by the colonized intellectuals' shared interest in stepping back and taking a hard look at the Western culture in which they risk becoming ensnared. fully aware they are in the process of losing themselves and consequently being lost to their people. These men work away with ranging heart and furious mind to renew contact with their people's oldest inner essence and farthest removed from the colonial times. Let us delve deeper. Perhaps this passion and this rage are nurtured or at least guided by the sacred hope of discovering beyond the present wretchedness. Beyond this self-hatred, this abdication and denial, some magnificent and shining era that redeems us in our own eyes and those of others. I say that I have decided to delve deeper, since perhaps in their unconscious, the colonized intellectuals have been unable to come to loving terms with the present history of their oppressed people. Since there is little to marvel at it in its current state of barbarity, they have decided to go further, to delve deeper. They must have been overjoyed to discover that the past was not branded with shame, but dignity, glory, and sobriety. So, once again, getting into one of the reasons why we started doing the breakdowns. I love history. I love African history. I love Black history. I love the global history of the diaspora. I'm a historian. I advocate for us to know our history. But as I've grown on this journey, I've also realized that we should know our history and learn our history, but we have to live in the present, and we can't run from the present, and we can't run from our American history. I know a lot of people don't like to see the movies or hear the stories about what happened to our ancestors, but it is our history. We have the history of people in North America, Black people in North America, and Black people in the United States of America. Yes, we should know our history and we should celebrate our history, but we shouldn't celebrate our history to the point to where we use it as escapism from our current conditions. That's what he's getting at. Because we're so concentrated on the past, we want to remove ourselves from our actual history as Black people in America. And that's not going to happen. On one end, we're mad at the school systems. We're mad at the government. We're mad at white supremacists for wanting to systematically remove our history from the school systems. But on the other end, we don't want to learn our history, and we're afraid to face the actual history that we have here in America. Our history is what it is, and it's up to us to change it, the masses. We cannot intellectualize ourselves out of it. We cannot remember ourselves out of our position, out of our situation here in America. If we don't fix it, nobody will. But we have to acknowledge it, recognize it, embrace it, and realize, yes, we have a history that is filled with terror, trauma, all the bad stuff you can think of. But how do we make a better future for ourselves if we're not being realistic about who we actually are and what our history actually is? When we consider the resources deployed to achieve the cultural alienation so typical of the colonial period, we realize that nothing was left to chance, and that the final aim of colonization was to convince the indigenous population it would save them from darkness. Sounds familiar because we're waiting on white people. Black people in America are expecting white people to change and be different and save us from the conditions that they created and put us in to help them be in the position that they are in. The result was to hammer into the heads of the indigenous population that if the colonists were to leave, they would regress into barbarism, degradation, and bestiality at the level of the unconscious. Therefore, colonialism was not seeking to be perceived by the indigenous population as a sweet, kind-hearted mother who protects her child from a hostile environment, but rather a mother who constantly prevents her basically perverse child from committing suicide or giving free rein to its malevolent instincts. The colonial mother is protecting the child from itself, from its ego, from its physiology, its biology, and its ontological misfortune. That's deep, because think about what he's saying. So we've been convinced not to love white supremacy, but to depend on white supremacy. And White supremacy is saving us from ourselves. The existence of it is saving us from having nothing because we don't believe in ourselves. It's convinced us that we can't do it on our own. And if we try to do it on our own, we will fail. So we need white supremacy. We don't love it, but we need it to survive. We need it to exist. We need it to exist. That's deep. That's deep on an unconscious level, or some of us a conscious level. The idea is white supremacy isn't something that we're glad we have, but it's something better than what we would have if we were on our own. It's saving us from our own demons. It's saving us from our own trepidation. That's deep. They did a psychological job on us. They did a real good job on us. This journey into the depths is not specifically national. The colonized intellectual who describes to combat these colonists lies does so in the colonial and on the continental scale. Hold on, let me read that again. Let me make sure it makes sense. All right. Hold on. This journey into the depths is not specifically national. The colonized intellectual who decides to combat these colonists lies, who combat the colonists' lies, does so on a continental scale. Okay. The past is revered. The culture, which has been revived from the past to be displayed in all its splendor, is not his national culture. Colonialism, little troubled by nuances, has always claimed that the nigger was a savage, not an Angolan or a Nigerian, but a nigger. For colonialism, the vast continent was a den of savages infested with superstitions and fanaticism, destined to be despised, cursed by God, a land of cannibals, a land of niggers. Colonialism, condemnation, and continental, I'd say the condemnation is continental on the scale. Colonialism's claim that the pre-colonial period was akin to a darkness of the human soul refers to an entire continent of Africa. The colonized endeavors to rehabilitate himself and escape the sting of colonialism obey the same rules of logic. The colonized intellectual, steeped in Western culture and set on proving the existence of his own culture, never does so in the name of Angola or Dahomey. The culture proclaimed is African culture. When the black man who has never felt so much a Negro as he has under white domination decides to prove his culture and act as a cultivated person, he realizes that history imposes on him a terrain already mapped out, that history sets him along a very precise path, and that he is expected to demonstrate the existence of a Negro culture. So that is the influence, the manipulation of the Western culture, the colonized culture, of the white supremacist culture. So we're either going to look at you two ways, a nigger or a Negro. And either way, it is dictated by us. You're either going to be a wild savage or you're going to be refined out here in these streets. And we can't have none of you wild savage boogaloos out here, jungle bunnies out here just running wild, running savage all over our place. So we need to refine y'all, especially if you want to get these crumbs off these tables. If you want these handouts, if you want us to continue to save you from yourself, you have to be refined. Going from the nigger to the Negro with these fine qualities. Put your pinky up. Make sure you don't smack when you eat. This is where the etiquette classes come in, right? Because I've always asked people, even since I was a little kid, hey, when we go to etiquette classes, whose etiquette are we learning? Well, we know whose etiquette we're learning. European etiquette. Because our etiquette is barbaric. The historical obligation to racialize their claim, to emphasize an African culture rather than a national culture, leads the African intellectuals into a dead end. Let us take an example of the African Society of Culture. This society was created by African intellectuals for a mutual exchange of ideas, experiences, and research. The aim of the society was therefore to establish the existence of an African culture, to detail it in nation by nation, and reveal the inner dynamicism of each of the national cultures. But at the same time, this society was responding to another demand, the need to take its place within the ranks of the European Society for Culture that threatened to turn into the Universal Society for Culture. At the root for this decision, there was therefore the preoccupation with taking its place on an equal footing in a universal arena, armed with a culture sprung from the very bowels of the African continent. Very quickly, however, this society proved incapable of handling these assignments, and members' behavior was reduced to window dressing operations, such as proving to the Europeans that an African culture did exist and pitting themselves against the narcissism and ostentation of the Europeans. We have demonstrated that such an attitude was normal and drew its legitimacy from the lie propagated by the European intellectuals. But the aims of this society were to deteriorate seriously once the concept of negritude had been elaborated. The African Society for Culture was to become the cultural society for the Black world and was forced to include the Black diaspora, i.e. the dozens of millions of Blacks throughout the Americas. The Blacks who lived in the United States, Central and Latin America, in fact, needed a cultural matrix to cling to. The problem they were faced with was not basically any different from that of the Africans. The whites in America had not behaved any differently to them than the white colonizers had to the Africans. We have seen how the whites were used to putting all Negroes in the same basket. During the first Congress of the African Society for Culture in Paris in 1956, the Black Americans spontaneously considered their problems from the same standpoint as their fellow Africans. Now listen, by integrating former slaves into the African civilization, the African intellectuals accorded them an acceptable civil status. But gradually, the Black Americans realized that their existential problems differed from those faced by the Africans. The only common determinator between the Blacks from Chicago and the Nigerians or the Tanganyikans was that they all defined themselves in relation to the whites. But once the intentional comparisons had been made and subjective feelings had settled down, the Black Americans realized that the objective problems were fundamentally different. The principle and purpose of the freedom rides, whereby the Black and white Americans endeavor to combat racial discrimination, have little in common with the heroic struggle of the Angolan people against the inequity of Portuguese colonialism. Consequently, during the Second Congress of the African Society for Culture, the Black Americans decided to create the American Society for African Culture. So now, this is important when we're looking at things on a global scale, on a Pan-African scale. Yes, we all have a common enemy, the Europeans. The Europeans who subscribe to white supremacy is our common enemy. But how they affect us throughout the globe is different. And so our answer to our problems cannot be a stagnant problem. So, but I think this is one of the things that Black people also cling to when, you know, the notion of we're not a monolith. And I get it. Globally, we're not a monolith. But within the nation that we live in, we are. We are within the nation that we live in, but on a global scale, even on a on a global scale, we're not a monolith, but we have similarities and we have commonalities that we can build upon, right? But it's the understanding of how to solve problems. Because with this, with all this being brought, all this information being brought to the table, the white supremacists in America and the white supremacists in Colombia and the white supremacists in the UK and the white supremacists in Argentina and the white supremacists in the Dominican Republic, they all have the same overall goal, but how they get to that goal is different. So how we approach solving the problems around the globe is different, even though we all want to get to the same end. How we get to that end is going to be different. And we have to be able to recognize that. And that's what Frantz Fanon was getting at. That was he's pointing out, being able to understand that when the black people throughout the globe got together and put all our problems on the table, we realized our similarities, but we really realized our differences and how we should approach our differences. But seeing that conditions didn't really change, we didn't come up with proper solutions for our problems. So it is clear, therefore, that the way the cultural problem is posed in certain colonized countries can lead to serious ambiguities. Colonialism's insistence that niggers have no culture and Arabs are by nature barbaric inevitably leads to a glorification of cultural phenomena that became continental instead of national and singularly racialized. In Africa, the reasoning of the intellectuals is Black African and Arab Islamic. It is not specifically national. Culture is increasingly cut off from reality. It finds safe haven in a refuge of smoldering emotions and has difficulty cutting a straightforward path that would nevertheless be the only one likely to endow it with productiveness, homogeneity, and substance. So going back to what Marimba Ani was talking about, what culture was. Culture protects. Culture is the immune system of a people. Culture predicts how we walk, how we talk, how we think, how we dress, how we move, how we dance, how we express ourselves, how we protect ourselves, who we protect ourselves from. Culture dictates that. But if another person, if another group, if the specific group who colonized you is controlling your culture, then what you're cultivating yourself into is still a product of your colonizers. And that has to be recognized. Our culture, the culture that we are producing, especially here in America, the culture that we're producing now is very toxic, very destructive. Now, that's not to say that's absolute. That's not to say all Black people in America are producing this toxic, destructive culture that we see on a regular basis. But it's being promoted not just by Black people, but by our colonizers, by our oppressors, the white supremacists on their platforms, and that people are getting paid, like always, people are getting paid to be minstrels. Like, I go back and I watch some of the old television shows that I used to watch, and I cringe at a lot of the scenes now, looking at how minstrel it is. That I, especially that I have a better understanding as an adult, how minstrel our culture is, what we created, what we cultivate, what we celebrate as Black culture, what we make excuses for. Well, they're just being themselves. Well, damn. That's the best version. But then going back to what Neely Fuller said, yes, because we are insane. The reason being that the colonized intellectual has thrown himself headlong into Western culture. Like adopted children who only stop investigating their new family environment once their psyche has formed a minimum core of reassurance, the colonized intellectual will endeavor to make European culture his own. Once again, our culture is not protecting us. Our culture was stripped away from us, and the culture that was given to us is a culture that helps us to demean ourselves and promote white supremacy. Not content with knowing Rabelais or Diodore or Shakespeare or Edgar Allan Poe, he will stretch his mind until he identifies with them completely. In some cases, however, at the very moment when the national parties mobilize, the people in the name of national independence, the colonized intellectual rejects his accomplishments, suddenly feeling them to be alienating. But this is easier said than done. The intellectual who has slipped into Western civilization through a cultural backdoor, who has managed to embody or rather change bodies with European civilization, will realize that the cultural model he would like to integrate for authenticity's sake offers little in the way of figureheads capable of standing up to comparison with the many illustrious names of the civilization of the occupied. History, of course, written by and for Westerners, may periodically enhance the image of certain episodes of the African past. but faced with his country's present day status, lucidity, and objectivity, observing the reality of the continent he would like to claim as his own. The intellectual is terrified by the void, the mindlessness, and the savagery. Yet he feels he must escape this white culture. He must look elsewhere, anywhere, for a lack of cultural stimulus comparable to the glorious panorama flaunted by the colonizer. The colonized intellectual frequently lapses into heated arguments and develops a psychology dominated by an exaggerated sensitivity, and susceptibility. This movement of withdrawal, which first of all comes from a petitio principii and a psychological mechanism and psychonomy, above all calls to mind a muscular reflex, a muscular contraction. Oh, nah, don't have no reflex and contraction now. Now this is when the person looks up and finds themselves entrenched, embedded within white culture, and feels that sellout spirit. Like, dang, this doesn't feel natural. This doesn't feel normal. This isn't where I need to be. But you're a little too entrenched in this culture. You're a little too entrenched in this, because are you really willing to give up all your gains to go back to really help the revolution, to really help your people become free? Because you're going to have to give up your position and your place and your gains. You have to give up all the love. And then you're going to have to go back and prove to your people that you're not a sellout, because you've been selling them out. But culture, though. But culture. This is Black excellence, though, right? Let's talk about Black culture, Black excellence for a minute, right? This is Black excellence. Black excellence is how close to white people can you be? How loved by white people can you be? This is Black excellence. This is Black culture. That's why I'm glad we're covering this. I'm glad he's talking about this on National Culture. Is the name of the chapter, right? Pairing it with Marimba Ani, explaining to us what culture should be, what culture really is, especially African culture. African culture produces the African. Negropean culture produces the Negropean, right? You're Black on the outside, but white in the mind. Everything that is good, everything that is great, everything that is an achievement has to be something within the realm of white supremacy. It has to have proximity to white supremacy. It has to be accepted by white supremacy and backed by white supremacy. If white people love it, we love it, right? So these are the marks. Go get as entrenched into white culture as possible. But once you do that, you got to remember the price you're going to have to pay on both sides to give it up and to get back. Now, a lot of us have entrenched ourselves deep in the white culture, white supremacy, white proximity. The assimilation, once again, can assimilation be our path to liberation? Let's ask the intellectuals. Let's ask the bourgeois. Let's ask the leaders. Because so far, assimilation has not been even close to helping us get to the liberation that we so greatly want. This liberation. How is entrenching yourself deep into the culture of your oppressor going to help you free yourself and your people? Ask yourself that question. Now, if we're just talking about rugged individualism, you're still not going to be free from white supremacy, from the system of white supremacy. It still will exist. But you will just find your comfortable place. And well, until you get your Negro wake-up call. Because it's coming. It comes. It comes. As soon as you feel comfortable. As soon as you feel like you can let your hair down, you get your Negro wake-up call. But that should let you know that you have entrenched yourself in the culture that's foreign to you. Parasitic. That is parasitic. Like Dr. Marimba Ani said, white supremacy is the parasite. The Africans are the host. Although this approach may take him to unusual heights in the sphere of poetry, at an existential level, it has often proved a dead end. When he decides to return to the routine of daily life, after having been roused by fever pitch and rubbing shoulders with his people, whoever they were and whoever they may be, all he brings back from his adventures are terribly sterile cliches. He places emphasis on customs, traditions, and outcomes in his pitiful, focused search seems, and his forced search seems but a banal quest for the exotic. This is the period when the intellectual extols every last particular of the indigenous landscape. The following dress of the Bao is regarded as a sacred, and shoes from Paris or Italy are shunned for Muslim slippers. Babushis. The language of the colonizer suddenly scorches his lips. Rediscovering one's people sometimes means, in the phase, wanting to be a nigger, not an exceptional nigger, but a real nigger, a dirty nigger, the sort defined by the white man. Rediscovering one's own people means becoming a filthy Arab, of going as native as possible, becoming unrecognizable. It means clipping those wings which had been left to grow. Giving up your image, giving up this perception that you created for yourself, this facade for yourself. Going from being a Negro, an African American, to a nigger. Because, you're looking at yourself through the eyes of white supremacy. And if you don't meet these white supremacist measures, then, you're less than. You're a dirty nigger. The colonized intellectual decides to draw up a list of the bad old ways, characteristics of the colonial world, and hastens to recall the goodness of the people. This people who have been made guardians of truth. This approach triggers among the colonists strengths and determination of the colonized. Once the colonists who had relished their own victory over whose assimilated intellectual realized that these men they thought saved the lands, that these thoughts have begun to merge with the nigger scam, the entire system loses its bearings. Every colonized intellectual won over, every colonized intellectual who confesses, once he decides to revert to his old ways, not only represents a setback for the colonial enterprise, but also symbolizes the pointlessness and superficiality of the work accomplished. Every colonized intellectual who crosses back over the line is a racial condemnation of the method and the regime, and the uproar it causes justifies its application, encourages him to persevere. If we decide to trace these various phases of development and the work of colonized writers, 3 stages emerge. First, the colonized intellectual proves he has assimilated the colonizer's culture. His works correspond point by point with those of his metropolitan counterparts. The inspiration is European, and his work can be easily linked to a well-defined trend in metropolitan literature. This is the phase of full assimilation, where we find Parnassians, symbolists, and surrealists among the colonized writers. The second stage, the colonized writer has his convictions shaken and decides to cast his mind back. This is that Negro wake-up call period, right? This period corresponds approximately to the immersion we have just described. But since the colonized writer is not integrated with his people, since he maintains the outsider's relationship to them, he is content to remember. Old childhood memories will surface. Old legends be reinterpreted on the basis of a borrowed aesthetic and a concept of the world discovered under the skies. Sometimes this pre-combat literature is steeped in humor and allegory. At other times, in anguish, malaise, and death, even nausea. Yet, underneath the self-loathing, the sound of laughter can be heard. The third and final stage, a combat stage where the colonized writer, after having tried to lose himself among the people, with the people will arouse the people. Instead of letting the people's lethargy prevail, he turns to a galvanizer of the people. Combat literature, revolutionary literature, national literature, energies. During this phase, a great many men and women who previously would never have thought of writing, now that they have found themselves in exceptional circumstances in prison, in the resistance, or on the eve of their execution, feel the need to proclaim their nation, to portray their people, and become the spokesperson of a new reality in action. After that Negro wake-up call, that was spurring remembrance of what the revolution was about in the beginning, in the first place: freedom, liberation, humanity, liberty, justice, righteousness, equality, equity, but most of all, humanity, being treated like human beings. But after your Negro wake-up call, you remember the revolution. You remember when you were young. You remember the past. You remember why your ancestors fought to get you here, even though you turned your back on all of that. And when I'm saying this, I'm talking to us, because this is what we did. This book is a great awakening of, no, I would say this book is holding a mirror up to us and making us see who we are and what we've done, and making us really evaluate, are we really making a difference? Are we really making progress? The answer is no, because once again, Black excellence is dependent upon white supremacy. White supremacy, white culture determines Black excellence. White supremacy determines Black excellence. It's the measuring point. White supremacy is the measuring stick for Black excellence. Not what is African, what is indigenously African, what is inherently African. That is not our measure of success. It is whiteness. It is what white people will accept, what white people will praise, what they will celebrate. And that is deep, because the intellectual then creates literature or creates content that is intended to arouse the people that he turned his back on. Yes, so you're arousing emotions, but like we read in the beginning, you are not a part of the actual revolution. So for us, we're out here arousing emotions, but on an everyday basis, what are we doing to actually be a part of the everyday, on the ground, grassroots revolution to empower the masses? What are you doing in your community? What am I doing in my community? Am I doing enough? Am I doing it right? These are all the questions going through my head as I'm reading this book. I'm like, man, but it's eye-opening though. We have to check ourselves though. We can't be egotistical. We've seen people come and be and have their egos out of whack, and nothing good comes from it. Nobody is above reproach. Nobody is above criticism. Nobody is above correction. No Black person, no white person, no human. I don't care what you have accomplished and how long you've lived. You are not above reproach. You're not above criticism. You're not above correction. Right? So the things that we thought were working, the things that we thought were progressing us, are only holding us back even more, are only making us more dependent upon white people, getting us further into white culture. So we are exhibiting a brand of culture that was given to us. Yes, we've taken it and we've blackened it up, but we haven't took out the original roots and the foundation of it. It's still a culture that's steeped in oppression, still a culture that's entrenched in terrorism and the keeping Black people at a specific level so white supremacy can continue to dominate. Culture is a powerful thing. Culture is powerful, man. We got to understand what culture truly is and be able to use it to our advantage. But first, we have to create something new for ourselves. It's real out here in these streets, man. So let me get to this part. A common mistake, hardly defensible, moreover, is to attempt cultural innovations and reassert the value of indigenous culture within the context of colonial domination. Hence, we arrive at a seemingly paradoxical proposition. In a colonized country, nationalism is in its most basic, most rudimentary, and undifferentiated form is the most forceful and effective way of defending national culture. A culture is first and foremost the expression of a nation, its preferences, its taboos, and its models. Other taboos, other values, other models are formed at every level of the entire society. National culture is the sum of all these considerations, the outcome of tensions internal and external to society as a whole and its multiple layers. In the colonial context, culture, when deprived of the twin supports of the nation and the state, perishes and dies. National liberation and the resurrection of the state are the preconditions for the very existence of a culture. The nation is not only a precondition for culture, its ebullition, its perpetual renewal and maturation. It is a necessity. First of all, it is the struggle for nationhood that unlocks culture and opens the doors of creation. Later on, it is the nation that will provide culture with the conditions and framework for expression. The nation satisfies all those indispensable requirements for culture, which alone can give it credibility, validity, dynamicism, and creativity. It is also the national character that makes culture permeable to other cultures and enables it to influence and penetrate them. That which does not exist can hardly have an effect on reality or even influence it. The restoration of the nation must therefore give life to the most biological sense of the term, to national culture. So we have to progress on all levels of humanity. We have to progress, but we have to, in that progress, have to be able to start creating our own new cultural patterns and new cultural norms and new cultural ways that can move us further from the influence of white supremacy. Because right now, all of our culture and all of our cultural expressions have the influence of white supremacy in it. Remember, our original African culture was stripped away from us and culture was given to us. And through that, we cultivated new cultural patterns and new cultural norms and new ways of existence for ourselves. But the roots of it are still in white supremacy. Therefore, that's why when we produce new things for ourselves and when we call it this Black excellence, white supremacy is still the root of our Black excellence. White supremacy is the root of Black excellence. It inspires Black excellence. It is the standard for Black excellence. And therefore, that's why we need to understand what culture is, understand what national culture is, understand how culture is produced, understand how culture affects us, and how we should move forward in creating new culture for ourselves to free ourselves. So I'm looking up. So the next chapter is Colonial War and Mental Disorders on page 181, and it goes from 181 to, it's a long chapter. Oh, so this is the last chapter. Colonial War and Mental Disorders go from 181 to 233. So 181 to 233. So we might end up chopping that one up, and then there's a conclusion. So we pretty much almost finished with this book. We're coming on the last chapter, and then we're getting into the conclusion: Colonial War and Mental Disorders. And I'm glad we're getting into the mental aspect of it because it goes back to what we're talking about. It's linking back to our chapter on national culture. The mentality of the people determines the culture that is created, and vice versa. The culture is created by the mentality of the people. Right? It one influences the other. So when we're talking about the culture of the liberator, the culture of liberation. The culture of liberation is trying to be cultivated within the soil that is nurtured, or soil that is mixed with the influence of white supremacy. White supremacy is some of the nutrients that's been poured into this soil. So everything that grows out of this soil will have the influence of white supremacy. So we have to find new soil and new nutrients and give these plants, give the things that we want to grow out of this soil only African nutrients, only African influences, only Black influences that is free from white supremacy. So everything that grows out of it can be an asset to us, can be productive and progressive for us, rather than continuing to be something that's productive and progressive for the white supremacists. Because remember, grows out of the soil, the best of the best that grows out of the soil is plucked and taken, becomes the intellectuals. It becomes the bourgeoisie, it becomes the leaders. And they further white supremacy, and they help to suppress what we have going on. Can't pull yourself up from your boots if you ain't got no boots and you don't have the means to make your boots, right? And every time you get close to having the means to make your boots, it gets destroyed by your enemy. So, but we have to find a way to free ourselves, to liberate ourselves, and inspire and empower the masses. It's not just about some of us. It's not just about me or you. It's about all of us. So once again, link in the description for you to get the book, The Wretched of the Earth by Franz Fanon. Make sure you like this video, comment, subscribe, share, do what you got to do. Let's run these numbers up. Let's get like 10,000 likes on this video. Let's get 10,000 likes on this video. Let's do it. Let's do it. We can do that. 10,000 likes on this video. Let's do it. Love you all. Let's catch the next video coming up.